Our second lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today is the first Sunday of a new church year. It's the first Sunday also of the season of Advent, these 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. For years now, I have always thought of Advent as a getting ready season, in part because of many Sunday school lessons I've taught that explain it this way to children. But recently, I came across an article which reminded me that the true work of Advent is not getting ready. It is waiting. The word Advent means an arrival of something momentous, either a person or an event. As a season, Advent is not just a time for us to get ready to commemorate Christ's birth. It is a time of waiting for God's arrival, an event we believe will one day happen when God will once again break into our world in an unexpected and unpredictable way. I'm betting I'm not the only one here who prefers to think of Advent as a getting ready season than a waiting season, because getting ready is something we're good at. Getting ready involves to-do lists and tasks that can be parceled out among family members and friends or among church volunteers. You do the grocery shopping, I'll do the cooking. You buy the presents, I'll wrap them up. At church, we can designate one group to decorate the sanctuary, another to organize the Christmas pageant, another to set up the giving trees. Of course, we'll need everyone to make cookies for Circle Fest. Getting ready is about doing, and most of us much prefer doing something to standing around waiting, especially when we're not even sure what it is we're waiting for. This preference for getting ready over waiting is embedded in our culture. Black Friday started as a way of getting people into the stores on the day after Thanksgiving for unprecedented, one day only, while supplies last deals. At first, the stores opened early Friday morning, but then a few years ago, the openings got pushed back to midnight. This year, I noticed that many stores were advertising deals starting at 5 or 6 p.m. on the day of Thanksgiving. In a few years, I suspect we might be eating our turkey for breakfast. The problem is we don't like waiting. Well, the earliest Christians didn't like waiting either. These first followers of Jesus were certain that the second coming, that time when Jesus would come again, was going to happen in their lifetimes, which meant that by the time the Gospels were written, decades after Jesus had died, risen, and ascended, the writers had to address the concern among their readers that Jesus still hadn't come back. Some scholars believe the main reason the Gospels were written down at all was to encourage and sustain Jesus' followers in the face of confusion and anxiety that prevailed while they waited and waited and waited for Jesus to return. That's why there are passages in the Gospels, like the one we heard today, where Jesus reminds his followers to stay awake, pay attention, keep alert. Otherwise, you might just miss it when God appears again among you. In this passage, Jesus speaks to his followers about what we call the apocalypse, or the second coming, that time when God will break into the world again, as God did in the person of Jesus. Jesus' point here is that no one, not even Jesus himself, knows when this will happen. This is what makes Advent as a waiting season so difficult. We don't know what it is we're waiting for or when it is going to happen. It's like joining a long line of people without having any idea how long the line is or what you'll get when you finally find yourself at the front of it. Well, it turns out that this not knowing, this uncertainty, might just be the point. After all, when God breaks into the world again, it is likely to be as unexpected as it was when the God of heaven and earth was born to an unwed, impoverished teenage mother in a backwater village. Advent is a reminder that we are waiting for God to come to us in a way that we probably won't recognize, at a time we cannot predict. So when we read these apocalyptic texts, there are three basic ways to interpret them. The first is to assume that we are actually living in the last days, and the troubles of our present time are signs of the imminent apocalypse. So stay awake, because Jesus is coming, and he is coming soon. A second interpretation says that the shift from this world to the next is coming, but we don't know when. It could be tomorrow, or it could be another 1,000 years. Either way, we need to stay ready. Well, I prefer a third option, which views these texts not as prophecy, but as a necessary reminder that God is always breaking into our world, calling the world towards what it can and will be. In this view, there are many small apocalypses, not just one big one. Many unexpected events that disrupt and permanently alter the landscape of our lives. I prefer this interpretation because it seems to me that most of us don't feel particularly anxious about the prospect of the coming apocalypse, but we all know something about the uncertainty Jesus speaks of in this passage. We may not have seen a flood like the one of Noah's time, but we have seen lives cut short and communities ravaged by natural disasters. We may not know much about people working in fields or grinding meal together and then inexplicably disappearing, but imagine for a moment that Jesus said this. 2 colleagues were working together. One was diagnosed with cancer. The other was not. 2 employees applied for a coveted new position. One got the job, the other did not. 2 couples got married. One stayed together. The other went through a messy and bitter divorce. 2 teenagers were navigating high school and adolescence. One succumbed to drug addiction. The other did not. We may not know much about the end of the world apocalypse, but we are all too familiar with unexpected life-altering events that turn our lives upside down. And in the midst of such events, we know what it feels like to cling to the promises of God, to wait for these promises to come true. We even know what it feels like to give up on those promises, which is why it is so vitally important that we do this waiting for God together. As Christians, we are invited, even commanded, to keep watch for the presence of God. And this watching and waiting, it is hard work, especially when we are suffering. We need to help each other watch and wait for God to show up and break in, because it may not happen in a way that is obvious or dramatic, and sometimes we need help to see it. So we gather together as a community, bringing all of our individual experiences with us, including all of the personal apocalypses that have made us question exactly who God is and how God works in our lives. When we come together, we strengthen one another. We remind each other we are not alone in our suffering or in our uncertainty. We offer each other comfort and solace. We keep each other company while we watch and wait for the signs that God is indeed among us, that God does care for us, even when it feels like things are falling apart. Most importantly, by waiting together, we give each other hope. Advent reminds us that God's people have always been called to cling tenaciously to hope in the face of all the evidence around us that hope is pointless. This is what the first Christmas taught us, that God sees our suffering, that God can and does and will intervene in our world, but that it will not be in ways we can predict or anticipate. As a country, we have entered into a time of waiting. No matter what you hoped the outcome of the presidential election would be, we can all agree that the old is falling away and something new is emerging. This means that we are now in a liminal space, that space sometimes barely discernible between where one thing ends and another begins. Theologian Richard Rohr says that liminal space is the most teachable space because we are so uncomfortable there that we just might be open to something new. In fact, he says liminal space might just be the only teachable space. It is where transformation happens. But liminal space is difficult space to be in and difficult space to stay in because it is terribly uncomfortable. It requires us to wait, usually while events that are out of our control unfold. We would much prefer if there was something we could do, some way to get ready for what is coming, but we can't, because what's to come has not yet been revealed. Which is why we so desperately need Advent, this liminal space that begins the Christian year. We need this season where we learn how to wait without losing hope. Advent reminds us of all that we don't know and can't predict. It teaches us that our safety and security cannot be found in family or country or even in church, but only in the arms of our wildly unpredictable but always loving God. Advent opens us to the possibility of hope. In his forthcoming book, Reclaiming Hope, Michael Ware tells about a sociologist who spent time with people whose severe depression led them to attempt suicide. This sociologist discovered that those who eventually emerged from their life-threatening depression did so in possession of a hope different from any kind of hope he had ever observed before. He called it a fundamental hope, hope that could only emerge from traveling through deep disappointment and despair. Today, we take our place in the long line of God's waiting people. We join this line, each of us with our own apocalyptic stories of tragedy and sorrow, of lives turned unexpectedly upside down. While we wait, we tell our stories, and we listen to the stories of others. We speak up when we glimpse the presence of God among us. We may not be exactly sure what it is we are waiting for, but we are nevertheless filled with the gift handed down to us from all those who have waited before us. Hope, true hope, biblical hope, hope that is fundamental and foundational, hope as persistent and as fragile as the flame of a candle, hope that God has come, that God is with us even now, that God's love flows through us and among us, hope that God will come again. Amen.